Hi, everyone. I'm Zara Barnes, executive editor of Self Magazine, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's virtual event sponsored by Pfizer, talking about the inside and out, a virtual event on living with eczema, managing emotional well-being, and addressing health disparities impacting people of color. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today for an honest, illuminating conversation about the real burden of eczema and the health disparities that exist when it comes to diagnosing, managing, and living with a chronic skin condition. In case you didn't know, today is World Atopic Eczema Day. Eczema is incredibly common, affecting approximately 10% of adults and approximately 20% of children globally. But these kinds of conditions don't usually get the same airtime as other health issues, despite the fact that they can impact everything from your physical and emotional health to your confidence, your relationships, and even your performance at work or school. For people of color, living with this chronic condition can be even more challenging due to the differences in how it presents and how that can affect receiving a diagnosis and appropriate care. So today, we'll be speaking with patients about how eczema can impact every area of their life and learning helpful tips for managing the physical and emotional toll it can take. We'll also find out more about what is being done to address these health disparities in research and treatment for managing skin conditions like eczema in people of color. Today's event is all about uncovering the true burden of eczema and learning what we can do at both a societal level and an individual one to take better care of each other. So let's kick off this discussion by learning what it's really like to live with eczema. First up, we have Daniel Boy, fashion and creative director, TV personality, and author from Singapore. Daniel is known as the godfather of Singapore fashion and was a judge on Asia's Next Top Model. He also happens to live with eczema, which he documented in his book, Behind Every Itch is a Backstory, The Struggle of Growing Up with Rash. Thank you so much for being here, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, Zara.
So to get us started, can you tell us a bit about when you were first diagnosed with eczema?
Wow, I don't really think there was a first moment. For as long as I remember, I've had eczema, but I think I was first made aware of it when I went to school, because you know how cruel kids can be, and having the kids taunt you and point out these red patches and laughing at you made me really self-aware and self-conscious of it. And I thought it would go away. I thought with age and would come wisdom, but it just got worse and worse. When I went to university, especially, it got really, really bad. And with the stress of university exams, that was when I had my first full-blown attack. I think it was only after I hit 40 and I sat down and I said, look, this is part of Daniel Boy's DNA. You can either choose to be miserable for the rest of your life or choose to live with it and find ways around it, when I actually found peace.
Can you describe what your symptoms were like in more detail? I feel like it's so helpful to just raise awareness of that.
When I was younger, I used to get breakouts where my joints were my elbows, at the back of my knees. And then when I got older and I started to be a little bit more active in sports and all, I started to get them behind my ears, on my face, down my neck. Then I started to get them on my feet and my fingers, and I still get them. Stress had everything to do with it, because then my scalp started to flake as well. So essentially, I've got rash from the top of my head all the way down to my toes.
Yeah. And so how does something like that affect your self-esteem as you were dealing with this outbreak?
You know, it didn't help that of all the careers in the world, I chose fashion, which is the most judgmental, one of the most judgmental industries in the world. But hey, it is what it is. I picked that career because I realized that it was my passion. It was something I was good at. But it was tough. It was really tough when you're surrounded with people who consider themselves perfect, when you're surrounded with so much beauty around. It was especially tough when I got cast in Asia's Next Top Model. And I come from Singapore. Singapore is a place where if you're not Pan-Asian or Caucasian, if you're not a model, you have no place on TV. And I'm none of the above. But it was tough. It was really, really tough to be on set every day and get treated like an outsider, to get makeup artists coming and say, "Oh, it's you. I've got to do your face." It's so hard to do your face. You've always got to wear long sleeve shirts because we can't have your rash showing on TV. But when the series aired, I started to get mail from people saying that they were very inspired by someone who had the guts to appear on TV, despite my condition. And I think that really helped me a lot.
How would you like to see the fashion industry be more inclusive when it comes to depicting people of different races?
Well, I started a digital fashion festival. One of the things we've embraced is inclusivity, responsibility, sustainability, and it's great that to see that the industry has become a lot more embracing of not just people of different skin tones, but people of different body shapes as well. Because at the end of the day, the fashion industry is supposed to speak to real people, and we are real people.
So you actually wrote a book about growing up with eczema, which is incredible. And I really want to know what made you decide to share your story in that way.
Well, I wrote that book right after Asia's Next Top Model. And a lot of people, when I started to hear from a lot of people, I realized that I've always been looking for a hero all my life. Maybe I could be a hero to these people. I hunted out people who actually suffer from eczema, whether it was severe like myself or mild, and I got them to model for the book. My photographer suffers from eczema. When the book came out, I was really surprised by the response because a lot of celebrities started coming out of the woodwork and saying, "Wow, you know what? Thanks for telling our story." Did I have to spend a lot of time thinking about whether I wanted my story to be exposed to the entire world? Yes. When I spoke to my publisher, there were many, many times I said, "You know what, let's kill this project. I don't think I want the world to know all my backstories." But then I realized if I can just touch one person.
Yeah, it's so important for people, as you explained, to have role models and realize that other people are going through the exact same thing. I know it's a vulnerable process, but it's really impressive to share your story in that way. And I would love to know, overall, what impact would you say eczema has had on your emotional well-being?
If I didn't suffer from eczema, if I was tall and good looking and everything, I might have turned out to be a brat. You know what I mean? I think eczema and my condition has actually kept me down to earth, has actually grounded me. I can say that now, right? But when I was going through all that trauma and all, I used to wonder every single day, why me? Why not someone else? Why did you choose me to inflict this condition on? But I think it gave me strength. It made me a stronger person. It made me a more resilient person.
What was it like dealing with eczema as you were also dealing with things like your social life?
In the first 10 years of my life, when I first started going to school, I was an introvert. I spent most of my time in the library. And looking back, I think it was a way of escaping so that I didn't have to socialize with people. I could just be in my own world. Because the more people I socialized with, or the more people I hung out with, the higher the chances of getting someone pointing out your eczema. So I became an introvert. And then as I grew older, I started to, as they say, grow a thick skin, and everything just went over my head, and I just took it as it was. I wasn't going to let that affect my life. But at the back of my mind, it still hurt. Comments like that still hurt. And I became very, very careful with who I chose to hang out with. I became very careful with the places I went to, and I became very careful with my clothing choices as well. You can't control when you're going to have a breakout, and Singapore is near the equator. We are so hot, and yet sometimes I'll put on a long sleeve top or put on a jacket just because I wasn't ready to face the world with red patches on my arm. So that was essentially my life.
What were some other things you did in your daily routine to help prevent or manage those flare-ups? I know that, as you mentioned, kind of dressing in a certain way can be helpful, but what about some other things?
Moisturizers are my best friend. I have to find ways of moisturizing myself all the time. So I have moisturizers everywhere in my home. I have moisturizers in my car, in all my bags, just so that I'm not uncomfortable. Because when you have dry skin and it starts to flake, it actually makes you. It's actually painful. It's actually really painful when your skin cracks.
Well, you've clearly given a lot of great advice to other people who have eczema and may be watching, but just to make sure, is there any other advice you would give to someone who's living with a skin condition, struggling with the way it impacts their self-esteem, their relationships, their career, and they're not really sure where to go next?
At the end of the day, they have to realize that this is not a punishment. It's not an affliction. It's we just drew the short end of the stick, and it shouldn't impact them in any way. They shouldn't hold back. They shouldn't stop socializing because of this. And if people don't want to hang out with you because of the way you look, if people don't break out with you because they're ashamed to be seen with you, then you don't really want to hang out with these people, do you? I mean, these people are really not your friends. You want to hang out with people who are supportive of you, and people who like you for who you are, warts and all, and people who lift you up. So I think don't be concerned about how people judge you. Be concerned about your state of mind and hanging out with the right people who create positive vibes for you.
What do you wish you could go back and tell your childhood self?
Oh, everything's fine. There's nothing wrong with you. Daniel, you were given this condition. It doesn't make you any less of a person. In fact, all the struggles, all the trials and tribulations you go through would make you a stronger, better person.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us, Daniel.
Thank you very much. I hope it was useful.
Of course, very useful. Now, because eczema is not one size fits all, we're going to hear from someone else who has been living with the condition for most of their life. I'm so pleased to introduce Cynthia Corfa, journalist and social media specialist in New Orleans, Louisiana. Cynthia is a contributing writer at 225 Magazine and founder of Brunch for the Soul, an event turned community and podcast with quarterly mixers to connect and empower women. Cynthia has also lived with eczema her whole life, which she's shared with her thousands of followers on social media. Cynthia, we are so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Zara. I appreciate it. I'm so excited to be here and talk about this.
Awesome. So let's dive in. I first always want to start with the foundational question of, can you tell us about when you were first diagnosed with eczema?
Yes, I was first diagnosed when I was a baby. I had it for as long as I can remember. I remember my mom telling me she used to put socks on my hands when I was a crib just to prevent me from scratching at night. So it has been a lifelong battle. And then in my mid-20s is when it really peaked and turned into a full body experience.
Right. So can you describe what your main eczema symptoms are like and what a flare-up is like for you?
I feel like textbook symptoms. I get really itchy. I get dry, flaky. I know a lot of times for Black people, like Black skin, we experience eczema differently. So sometimes it looks just like darker skin and it looks maybe more raised. And sometimes the heat triggers it. So in New Orleans, where it's very humid and hot, that really typically bothers my skin. So sometimes it can be red. Sometimes it could just look like a darker brown, but a lot of itchiness. And sometimes when it was at its peak, when it was really bad, it could ooze, it could leak. So I really relate to anyone who is battling the different stages of eczema.
Right. It sounds like such a journey that can be so tough, not only physically, but emotionally. And as someone who has been dealing with this basically your whole life, how did eczema impact your self-esteem as a child and young adult?
As a child, I can honestly say it was way harder. Kids can be tough, they can be honest, and they are quick to point out your flaws. So when I was young, it wasn't as bad as I had experienced later in my 20s, but I had small patches of eczema behind my knees and in between my arms. And so that prevented me from wearing shorts a lot of the time. So I would wear pants. I didn't wear my first pair of shorts until I was in high school. And my mom even argued to get my PE teacher to let me wear pants during physical education. So it was just, I could laugh at it now, but it was extremely challenging as a child. But I would say that really encouraged me to develop tough skin, literally and figuratively, that I had to become just had to embrace my skin. I had to celebrate it. And so in college, I started modeling regardless of my eczema. And I have just kind of embraced it ever since. And ever since this whole self-love movement has kind of, come to the forefront, that really, really helped. So people like Winnie, the model, these people really encourage me to embrace my skin as is and just show it off.
Reaching that point of embracing and acceptance is so liberating. So I'm really glad you've been able to get to that space. And now that you're in that space and knowing everything you know from this journey with eczema, what do you wish you could go back and tell your childhood self?
I wish I could tell my childhood self to enjoy, just be present. Enjoy your body as is. Enjoy your skin as is. At the time, those small rashes seemed so large, and I felt like they were the first thing that everyone saw about me, when in reality, they weren't even paying attention to them until I pointed it out. So I would tell myself to love myself, remind myself that you're beautiful, and this is really just a small little fraction of who you are. And I have so much more personality to showcase than my eczema.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can tell. It's coming through for sure. So more recently, how has living with eczema impacted your career?
Well, with COVID, honestly, COVID-19 and my full body breakout, they happened simultaneously. So right before we were forced to stay at home, I was experiencing some of the worst eczema I had ever had. And I was scratching. I was, a full-time journalist at a magazine. And so I was scratching under my desk. I was having to, all these deadlines were coming back to back. And so, of course, as you know, I'm sure, Zara, working in the magazine industry, it is a high stress job. And so I was most definitely not handling that well. I was drinking a lot of coffee. I was eating a lot of quick and convenient meals. So I really wasn't serving my body well. And it was showing me in all the ways. It has definitely impacted how I do my work. And it has encouraged me to put myself first. And it's encouraged me to put ease first.
That stress skin connection is clearly so real. I would love to hear about some of your favorite self-care habits and activities that, even when you are in a high stress situation or mindset, help you stay grounded.
I just like to sit still. One of the big things I feel like any eczema warrior knows is it becomes a habit to scratch. It becomes this nervous thing to do. And it just kind of becomes second nature to start moving your hands and just seeing what skin you can pick at. So I have to practice being still. So that can look like meditation. That can look like yoga. I am a huge bath person. I know most doctors would argue you shouldn't take that long of a bath, but I live in the bath because sometimes it's the most comfortable place I can be in my skin condition.
So thinking back to your eczema journey thus far, have you faced any obstacles in getting dermatologic care as a Black woman or getting the right type of dermatologic care?
I definitely have. While it's been fairly easy to find dermatologists around online or through doctors. I would say that it hasn't been as easy to get the type of care that I would prefer. So, sometimes I would go and I just felt like I would be rushed. I would be dismissed. I felt as if whatever I was experiencing wasn't what they had seen. And they tell me that plenty of times, like, this doesn't look like what we've seen before, or this is a really different case. And so then I felt kind of ostracized. I felt kind of alone. And then when I would be in there, they'd show me examples sometimes of what eczema might look like, what certain rashes might look like. And obviously none of them looked like mine. I never really identified as a Black woman with the white skin, with the red rashes that they might have on the photos or on the eczema posters. And so sometimes I felt like, okay, who is going to understand what I'm going through? What am I going through if I can't see it in today's doctor's office? So that was really tough for me.
Right. It's such a tough experience. And it's one that I think a lot of people watching can probably relate to as well. So I'm wondering, what advice would you give to other people of color who are dealing with skin issues or suspect they have a condition like eczema and they're trying to find care?
You have to document your journey. I had to be the person to document how bad it could be, how good it could be, what my skin looked like at its best, what it looked like at its worst. And then I essentially bring all these photos to the doctor's office with me so that they could study it themselves. Because yes, sometimes we very well, Black people, people of color, we very well might be their first patient who looks like you. You might be the first person of color that they've ever had to work with. And so they very well might not know what your skin condition is or how to treat it exactly. So I say, bring all of your photos and also consult multiple people. Sometimes you have to go to social media, or if you happen to know any other eczema warriors. I didn't really know too many at the time, but if you do, ask for help, because you are the only person who can speak on behalf of yourself and your condition. And I would hate for anyone to do what I did, which was wait. I was in denial. I kind of hoped it would get better. And then I felt misunderstood. And then I just didn't feel like anyone was listening. So I just kind of let it get to its absolute worst until I had to go to the doctor. And so I would never recommend that anyone does that to themselves, and just document your journey and speak up for yourself.
Such good advice. People need to deeply believe that they deserve that care, that appropriate management, and an empathetic ear. So love that advice. And in terms of social media, we've touched on it a bit, but your feed is filled with such beautiful body positive sentiments. So I'm wondering what advice you have for accepting or embracing your skin when you live with a skin condition.
First of all, people love authenticity. So if you care at all what people think, know that people love when you present the most authentic version of yourself. It is best to just love yourself so loudly that everyone really doesn't have an opportunity besides loving you, right? Like I think of people like Lizzo and Rihanna and Beyonce, like they love themselves so loudly that we just see their light and we just want a piece of it. And so I would kind of say for myself, that's how I think. I think, you know what? If not me, then who? I'm going to wear these shorts with my eczema all over my legs. I'm going to wear this crop top, even though you can see the rash on my stomach, because again, there is some little girl out there with eczema who is hoping and praying for somebody to normalize this and make this okay. So I'm going to be that person. And that's kind of the pep talk that I give myself. Like, if not me, then who? So that's what I think doing that.
Amazing. I mean, on behalf of all of the eczema warriors watching, thank you for being a crusader in that space. And thank you for sharing all of these wonderful insights with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for encouraging this conversation. This means so much to me. and like you said, everyone watching. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this, truly.
Now, let's dive deeper into the science and the issue of health equity with Dr. Zakia Presley-Rice. Dr. Rice is a triple board certified dermatologist at Dermatology Associates of Georgia. Dr. Rice is also the president of the Atlanta Association for Dermatology and Dermatologic Surgery. Throughout her career, she has served on more than 30 clinical trials and has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, with much of her research focusing on eczema. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rice.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So I wanted to get us started with a really foundational understanding of what we're talking about here. So first, can you please explain what eczema is and what's going on in the body during a flare-up?
Yes, so I want to be completely honest. We're still figuring out all the pieces of this puzzle. In fact, we don't know what the whole puzzle even looks like. But with that said, what we do know is that eczema or atopic dermatitis is basically a combination of genetic and environmental triggers. And at the genetic level, so what you inherit from your parents, there's two main problems. There's a problem with your barrier of your skin, and then the second problem is increased inflammation that's gone awry.
Okay, how does that barrier of the skin factor in? What is your skin barrier ideally supposed to be doing?
So that's a great question. So, our skin is the largest organ in our body. It does so much for us. It helps keep the outside world out and the inside world in, simply put. But, it's not completely sealed. There are some areas where things that we need to get in gets in, and then things that need to come out get out. And so in atopic dermatitis, that barrier, that epidermal barrier, is not completely functioning healthy enough. So there is defects in proteins that help seal the skin.
Okay, and so then the inflammation factor, how does inflammation lead to eczema symptoms?
When we have this inflammation that's gone awry deeper in the skin, so if you think about the skin as a 3-layered cake, epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous tissue, in that dermal region is mostly where that inflammation's at, and that corresponds to itching and swelling and redness. Then we know that that inflammation then causes more problems with the barrier in the skin. And then in turn, things that are supposed to be kept out of the skin get into the skin and then increase inflammation, and on and on and on.
Right. And then there are also environmental triggers that you mentioned. What are some of those? Do those only affect people who are already predisposed to eczema because of genes?
Yeah, so that's that dance between, what we inherit gene-wise and developing the condition, and then the environmental triggers that can make it worse. And I say for each individual, it can be very different. So some individuals may have more of a reactivity to a certain fragrance or a certain dye or a certain resin that's in clothing, whereas another may have issues with environmental pollens, and on and on and on. But for one person, what affects them and makes their eczema worse is not necessarily the same for someone else. It's complex.
Right. And I feel like that is what can make it so hard to manage eczema. What works for someone else, maybe even your parents, if they have it, won't necessarily work for you. It seems like a very individual journey for a lot of people.
It is. It's a complex puzzle piece.
And so when it comes to what eczema looks like, how might eczema differ depending on your skin color or ethnicity?
In general, skin color is defined as certain skin types that have more melanin than not. And classically in dermatology, we talk about Fitzpatrick skin types 1 through 6, where 4 and 6 are skin of color and 1, 2 through 3 are not. But to be clear, all skin types produce some form of pigment or melanin. It's just that skin types 4 through 6 present with more. And just to give you an example, I'm a skin type 5. In terms of how eczema presents differently in skin of color, well, sometimes it can be a little bit harder to diagnose. In that red that presents in eczema that is more obvious in skin types 1 and 3 is less obvious in skin types 4 and 6, because that red becomes more purple, or what we call violaceous. And then additionally, it just may be hard to see altogether. And so you can't just rely on your eyes. You also have to rely on your hands to feel where there's areas of inflammation.
So I'm wondering if there are certain conditions people of color may often be misdiagnosed with when they actually do have eczema.
I think when it comes to diagnosis, there's always different diagnostic possibilities. And I don't think there's necessarily a lot of room for misdiagnosis of the condition itself. Where I do think there's an issue is maybe the patient not feeling heard or misunderstood in terms of the severity of the eczema that they're presenting with, and not having that opportunity to fully express how they feel. And then subsequently, maybe potentially being undertreated.
And so what are some of the factors that make it harder for some patients of color to be fully heard, to not be undertreated, to have their providers understand that severity?
Well, I think there's a long history in this world, in this country, where people of skin color have been discriminated against. And so there's the background of that. There's also the ongoing issues of that. And I think, most patients coming in, if not all, to a physician setting are going to feel uncomfortable, vulnerable. And I think that's heightened in someone all the time, but a lot of times who already is part of a more vulnerable population.
So do you have advice for people who are looking for appropriate care for their eczema? They're looking to feel seen and heard, and they're not finding it.
So overall, I think there's many things that one can do as a provider to make sure patients of skin of color feel more comfortable in their office. First of all, know the data. So we do have data with eczema or atopic dermatitis that shows that African-American patients are 6 to 7 times more likely to go through different dermatologists before they find the dermatologist that's right for them. And then also listen to stories and anecdotes of those who are having poor experiences and why do they have those experiences. And then overall, I think it just takes simple acts of saying, I hear you. And then I often say this to all my patients, if it's right, and particularly with atopic dermatitis and skin of color, it is, you are in the right place and I'm going to take good care of you.
I feel like that reassurance can go really far for a lot of people who are feeling very vulnerable. So it's nice to just put that out there for them. Can you explain why that is so key for patients to be able to go to a dermatologist who understands how skin conditions manifest, no matter their skin color?
Yeah, I think simply put, just in terms of within the dermatology community, it's important to have many voices at the table. That includes people of different skin colors, races, religion, and on and on and on. I think when it comes to the population of patients that we treat, I think they need to see themselves represented in our field. And it's not always the case that someone of skin of color or someone who's African-American feels comfortable coming to me as an African-American, but sometimes it is.
Right. And then you've talked about the kind of shame and stigma that a lot of patients feel as well. How does that have an impact on their emotional well-being?
When we have a diagnosis, acute even, so something that's short-term or subacute, slightly longer term, or chronic, really long-term, which that's the box that eczema fits in, there is this, stepwise process you go through of coping with that diagnosis. And I think, one of those steps is shame. And why do I have this? What did I do wrong to get this? And so that's something that patients often start at, they may move out of, and it's not unusual to cycle back to that. And that's just normal. And I think the other thing I want to say in terms of not just shame, but in terms of that itch and quality of life disturbance is that we do see increased levels of depression and anxiety that go with that.
If someone suspects they might have eczema, but they're struggling to get a diagnosis, what would you suggest they do?
I think the first thing is finding a qualified, board-certified dermatologist. And the best place to go just overall is the American Academy of Dermatology site, where you can go into Physician Finder. You can search even by region and pull up a board-certified dermatologist. And various providers have done, I think, a great job of showing their interest. So you want to look for someone who has eczema or atopic dermatitis as an interest for them. And they also have other details about them and their practice. I think additionally, the Skin of Color Society also has a great list of individuals who are not only interested in potentially treating skin of color, but then skin of color with eczema. So first, find the right provider that's for you. And, we all have different personalities. And so it may take a few before you find that one that matches your style, but you'll find them. And I think also don't forget about other patients, other people in your community who have already suffered with atopic dermatitis eczema, who have a provider that they love. And there's nothing that beats word of mouth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rice. This was so illuminating.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure. I wish we had more time.
Same. Finally, I'm thrilled to introduce Alicia McCullough, licensed clinical mental health therapist and national certified counselor, who is here to discuss a bit more about the psychological and psychosocial side of this. Alicia is a full-time psychotherapist whose work centers the intersectional narratives of Black and Brown folks experiencing mental and emotional distress. She's the founder of the Holistic Black Healing Collective, and she's been recognized as a major contributor to the field of Black mental health. Alicia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be here today.
Absolutely. So I wanted to get us started with a kind of baseline question. Can you tell us a bit about why you became a therapist and what your ethos is when it comes to mental health care?
Absolutely. And so I got into therapy because I really wanted to support others on their healing journey. At the time when I got into the therapy field, I didn't have that language exactly, but I always knew that I wanted to help and support folks and just their overall well-being and to help them with like life difficulties. And so that's what really got me into therapy. And ever since then, I've really enjoyed the work that I've done. And so I practice from a anti-colonial perspective, centering anti-oppression work in all of the therapy that I do. And so that's been really great to me because it really aligns with my value system and really connects with the clients that I'm working with, especially those that experience marginalization.
How can a physical condition impact someone's mental well-being? What is the connection like there?
Yeah, so I truly believe that the physical, the mental, and the spiritual are all interconnected. And so when we have a physical illness, even if it's just a common cold, we can feel in our bodies where we're like, okay, I'm feeling down for today, or I'm not really up for it to maybe go out and do all the things I used to do. And so it really shows that what we're dealing with is all interconnected. And so when we think about those physical illnesses, it is important to also really center that mental side as well, because when we're only treating the physical, we're missing the response and the emotions and the reactions that we're having throughout that physical concern. And so I think it's important to really be fully integrative when we think about our health in general and really bring in all components of what that looks like.
Absolutely. I feel like a lot of people will maybe just address one element, like they'll just address the physical and they'll feel like they're doing everything right, but they're not getting the relief that they're looking for. And it is so important to have that holistic approach. And part of that holistic approach, of course, is issues of health equity and racial injustice and justice. And so as such an expert in this space and as someone who has centered that so much, how can issues of health equity and racial injustice in healthcare impact someone's mental and emotional well-being?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because when we think about equity, I often just think about access. I think that it can really impact someone. So, for example, if you are dealing with a concern and you don't have a healthcare provider who you can go visit, that's going to affect your ability to get the care that you need. If you do go to your healthcare provider and it's maybe not a provider that looks like you or understands your backgrounds or, your struggles or things like that, that can be an isolating experience for you. And so I think it's important that we do have accessible healthcare, not only in just making it cost affordable and in locations that people can go to, but I also think having that representation of providers is really important as well.
Very much agree. It's been interesting to see conversations about that representation become a lot more mainstream. It's encouraging, but of course, there's so much work to be done. A lot of your work centers the mental and emotional health of people of color. What do you wish more people of color knew about taking care of themselves in that way?
Sometimes we think about mental health as these grandiose, things that we have to do. So we have our therapy, we have our journaling, we have like a whole list of things that we're doing. But what I try to do is really bring it back to the basics, and so that could look like waking up in the morning and really just checking in and saying, where am I at mentally today? And so maybe you woke up and you were frustrated or you were already in a bad mood. I think that's the place to really start of like, what happened that got me here? And, how do I want to spend the rest of my day? And so I think it is more so like the small steps of just checking in with yourself. And then, of course, like seek out some therapy, definitely go to support groups and things like that. But I think some of the healing work is really in what we already hold in ourselves. And it's important that we just really center that and check in about that first.
So being a patient in a medical setting can obviously be a really fraught and frustrating experience, especially for Black and Brown people. What advice do you have for staying emotionally well when you're trying to navigate medical settings and the stigma and discrimination that happen all too often in those settings?
Yeah, I think that one of the first things is really validating yourself and knowing that the experience you're having is not inaccurate, that this is a real thing, the discrimination or the way you're being treated. And there's studies that show that. And so really being thoughtful and validating where you are. And then I also think that it can be helpful to have a support person if you have that access to that. And so it could be like a friend or a parent or a sibling that you could potentially bring into a visit with you. And then I also think too, just coming prepared. I've personally been in settings where, I've been with my provider and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm dealing with this thing here, but, I don't know how to communicate it because, sometimes there's that fear and anxiety that comes up from being in that setting. And so I do think it's, maybe writing down some questions beforehand, being super aware about what your symptoms are as well, so that you can communicate that to the best of your ability. And so just in summary there, really validating yourself, maybe bringing in a peer support person, and then also just being prepared ahead of time just so you can communicate where you are.
That's such a good trifecta of tips. I feel like it can be so overwhelming to anticipate this appointment and have the anxiety and then be there. And I definitely have had moments where I feel like my mind goes blank and I don't know what it was that I meant to bring up. So I love that tip, especially of coming prepared. That's great. What tips do you have for finding appropriate care, since accessible, affordable, culturally competent mental health care can be a challenge to find?
For sure. And I think that the thing that I usually ask clients to do, like even, before we start our session, is really sitting down and saying, what do I need out of a provider? And so that could be checking in and saying, I want a provider that shares the same racial identity as I do, or maybe they have a specialization in like, a certain thing that I'm dealing with. Really take inventory of that, write down a list. And then from there, that'll help center your research around what type of person you're looking for. Now you can just Google and say like, hey, where are some sites that I can find some therapy on? And then go through and see if you find someone in your area and have the things you're specifically looking for.
But even when care is accessible, a lot of people, of course, have hesitations about starting therapy and seeking support. And this can be true for a lot of people of color. So what misconceptions do you want to clear up about therapy and what it means about a person to actually seek support in this way?
Yes, I really love that you asked that, because I think that there can be some stigma around mental health therapy, specifically this idea that, in order to seek out treatment or help, that you have to be like severely, in distress or disoriented. And I think that that's a myth, and we see that in media. And so I really want to do the job of like debunking that myth and saying that, even if you're dealing with just something that seems so minuscule to you, that could be something to come in about. It could be something deeper beyond that layer of what you're seeing that, you're actually dealing with. And for most folks, it is. And so I would say that, seek out that therapy anyway, like go to that person, even if you're like, I don't know if this is big enough to talk about, still reach out, like it's so worth it. And so I definitely say like breaking down this idea that you have to be in a severe space in order to seek out help.
Yes, asking as a first step is so important. I agree. And thank you so much, Alicia. I learned so much. I'm sure our audience members did as well. And hopefully there are some great takeaways they can incorporate every day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Now we are going to go into some questions we've received for all of you about life with eczema. So I wanted to start with a question for Cynthia and Daniel. Someone writes in, lately my eczema flare-ups have left me feeling uncomfortable, affecting me physically and emotionally. Do you have any tips that have worked for you that will help me feel more confident in my own skin? What a good question.
You need to be in the right state of mind, and a lot of my eczema is triggered by stress. So sit back, take it as a sign that you need to relax and rest. I also think that we need to hydrate a lot. So I drink a lot of water and try not to take too many baths, because then my skin gets really, really dry.
I would say, honestly, it starts from within. I've had to do a lot of work on real self-love, loving myself as is in each stage. And I've learned that in doing that, that promotes healing. So whether it's counting the things that you love about yourself, dancing in the mirror, finding something that you can wear that makes you feel better, I really have to fuel myself with as much self-love as possible so that I can feel as confident going into the world.
Lovely. Yeah, we talk a lot about self-love at Self, obviously, and those are some of the tips that do actually really help people. So, Dr. Rice, question for you. Someone writes in, my son has had an itchy rash, but I've been having trouble nailing down if it is eczema or not. What are some signs to look out for regarding eczema in patients with a darker skin color?
That's a great question. So I think overall, not only do patients and parents struggle with trying to figure out what is going on with an itchy rash that's presenting one time or many times, seek out a qualified dermatologist, someone who is qualified at looking at pediatric skin, which is usually a pediatric dermatologist, but we have a number of dermatologists as well, because there's not a lot of us pediatric dermatologists that are also qualified, and have them do an evaluation, both a history and that exam is key to make the diagnosis.
Alicia, how can someone figure out how to create a good self-care routine that they can actually stick to and develop skincare habits that might be beneficial for their eczema? And I know for a lot of people, when it comes to creating those habits, the emotional component is a big part of creating a sustainable routine. So what are your advice?
And so for some people, I've heard a lot of folks say, that stress reduction. And so stress reduction could look like doing some yoga. It could look like talking to a therapist or joining a healing circle. And so there's so many ways to reduce stress, whether it's going for a walk or, even interacting with animals or pets or things like that. And so all of those can be ways to reduce stress, but it's really figuring out for you what feels realistic, what feels within your means to be able to do it, and also what feels accessible for you as well. And so I think making a self-care plan that feels like it's accessible is really important for your overall mental health, your self-care, and for managing any type of chronic conditions that cause that emotional stress and dysregulation in that emotional area.
And so for the next question, this is for everyone. Dr. Rice, I would love for you to start from the provider point of view. So someone writes in, I've only recently been diagnosed with eczema, and there's so much information for me to go through online. What are some tips to get up to speed faster and prep for my next appointment?
Actually, I just heard a quote, there's information everywhere, but wisdom is what we're seeking, right? So without really knowing how to decipher what you're getting, it's just more noise. So I think, there's positivity to having, internet and information at our fingertips, but having someone to guide you through it, I think is key.
And Cynthia, as someone who has been on the other side of this and probably had to sort through resources and information, do you have any tips for someone who has this question about how to navigate that aspect?
I honestly have shuffled through a few dermatologists because I often found that my case was kind of dismissed or that people just kind of overlooked the severity of my eczema. So through that, I did learn to come prepared because I would start feeling nervous. I would feel rushed. And so from then on out, I started coming with a notepad on my phone, whether it's on your phone or physically, and I write down my talking points. So I think of it as, would you go to a restaurant and leave if your order wasn't met or if it wasn't satisfied? No. So the same thing goes for your treatment with your doctor. So I try to make sure that when I see my dermatologist, I'm asking them about everything. Why is this happening? And if I feel any uncertainty, send them a follow-up. Thankfully, with COVID, the medical field has now went to telehealth. And so now you can ask them questions via phone, computer, whatever. So if I have any follow-up questions, I try to make sure I jot those down and send those the same day so that there's just full clarity.
I think all the ladies have given really, really great tips. And I wish I'd met all of you a long time ago, because for the longest time, I felt ashamed of talking about my condition. As Cynthia said, I went to tons of dermatologists as well because they tend to dismiss it and not take it seriously. And maybe it was on my side as well, because I found it really hard to talk about the condition. Find a trusted person to talk to. If that trusted person is your dermatologist, find a trusted dermatologist who can be a confidant, and don't be ashamed to talk about it, because at the end of the day, all this advice is going to give you peace of mind, but it has to start from you.
Absolutely. Dr. Rice, this is an excellent question we received for you. So from your perspective, is there anything that can be done to combat health inequities people of color face when it comes to managing skin conditions?
I think when it comes to, what do we do in dermatology with having more what I call skin inclusivity, inclusion of all skin types. It starts with number one, probably having more dermatologists of color. Number two, having dermatologists overall, those of color and not, just having more expertise and comfort in having conversations about skin of color and diagnosing it and treating it. Just having skin of color conversations not be at the sideline, but more mainstreamed. I definitely say in the past couple of years, you're seeing that. It's a start, but by no means are we finished.
So I want to thank you all so much for your incredibly thoughtful responses. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot and will hopefully be able to incorporate this into their own lives. I'm now pleased to introduce Michael Gladstone, Global President of Inflammation and Immunology at Pfizer, to close us out.
Zara, thanks so much for the introduction and for moderating this event on such a great day for the eczema community. With everything happening in the world around us, it's especially meaningful for us to come together as a community right now. We've covered a lot of ground today, from disparities in care to the profound physical and psychological burdens that a condition like eczema can have on patients. But it's clear there's a lot of room for us to improve and to partner together as in a united front to raise the awareness and improve upon the care of all patients with dermatologic conditions. I'm grateful for everyone that joined us today, and I'd like to share my utmost appreciation with Daniel and Cynthia for their vulnerability, their candor, and their perspective on living life with eczema. I'd like to thank Dr. Rice and Alicia as well for their insights on new approaches to combat these very real concerns. All these folks are on the front lines of improving care for everyone living with inflammatory skin conditions. These conditions impact 30 to 70% of the global population. Think about that for a moment. That's 1 or 2 out of every 3 people we know. Skin conditions like eczema, psoriasis, pruritus, alopecia areata, they're among the most common healthcare problems worldwide. And these conditions not only take a physical toll, but they take an emotional toll on patients. We need to learn how to support the needs of all patients living with inflammatory skin conditions. Encouraging greater diversity, ensuring equitable access to treatments, expanding clinical trials. These are just 3 examples of how we can positively move the needle on equity. We think about equity, the idea that every person needs to be seen, heard, and cared for. It's our responsibility. And the good news is the status quo is starting to change. Patient advocacy groups and medical organizations worldwide, like the Skin and Color Society, the British Association of Dermatologists, and the American Academy of Dermatology, they're all raising awareness and striving for equitable care for people of all races and ethnicities. And at Pfizer, we're working right alongside these organizations. We're supporting fellowship in patients of color. We're addressing healthcare literacy and supporting the development of multilingual eczema patient education materials. We've also made a commitment to design clinical trials so that enrollment can reflect the diversity of the communities where we conduct these trials. We're committed to doing our part to address the inequities that patients of color face in healthcare. I want to thank you all for joining us today, for being such an important part of the discussion about the effects of eczema, both inside and out.